This summer, my wife and I had an opportunity to take our two boys, our two foster children, and meet up with her family down in Missouri at Lake of the Ozarks and to hang out a little bit and spend some time together. One of the first evenings we were there, we headed down to the dock right off of this little cabin where we were staying and put the kids all in life vests and went off on the dock, sat on the edge, and we're dangling our feet in the water. And whenever I'm around water during a sunset, I always have these deep, profound thoughts. And I'll give you an example. As we were there in Missouri, I looked out over the water and I thought to myself, do they have alligators in Missouri? And as I started to ponder over this question, then I began to think to myself, it sure is muggy here in Missouri. Surely there are alligators. And I couldn't stop thinking about alligators. And I looked down at where I was dangling my feet, and I got to be honest, you couldn't see more than about 4 inches down. And I thought, if there are alligators in this water, I'm not going to see them before it's too late. Now, I'm kind of joking around with it, but I gotta tell you, I get a little twitchy when I start thinking these things and I'm around water. And as I'm thinking about alligators, I hear somebody to the left of me scream. It wasn't a long scream, but it was enough for me to think there are alligators in Missouri. And I quickly pulled my feet out of the water and went running to the other side of the deck. It wasn't until I turned around I realized everybody went in the opposite direction that I did. See, the person who screamed was my wife, and she wasn't scared. She was startled because one of the kids fell off the dock. Now, they were in a life vest and they were okay. It just startled her for a moment, and everybody saw a child floating in the water, and they quickly pulled that child out, and everything was okay. Thankfully, everybody was more concerned about the child than they were me, so they didn't notice that I had actually run away from the one who needed help. I think as it might be somewhat comical to think of a 300-pound man convinced an alligator was ready to pull him into the lake, it's not as comical when we see this playing out in our culture right now, particularly in certain areas of our country for majority of conservative white America, where you have people professing Jesus as their Lord and Savior, but seemed more concerned about self-preservation than those who need help. I want to ask the question, in what ways do we distort the gospel? See, while I've been disgusted with certain things I've seen play out in the media, the reality is that as I've become more aware of my own role in systemic racism and my own role in silencing the voices of those who have had a history of being pushed to the side and silenced, I realize that there's ways that I distort the gospel. So I'm going to share a passage from Galatians, and I want you to take some time to take personal inventory in your life. In what ways do we distort the gospel? In Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, Paul writes these words, "I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we've said before, now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please him, I would not be a servant of Christ." My wife and I are foster parents, and we have a young girl who spent the first 16 months of her life with us before she was adopted by an aunt in another state. And for the sake of the story, we'll just call her Valerie. And Valerie became very dear to our family. My boys loved her. Her aunt is going to name her a different name. We'll use the name Evelyn. And so my wife and I have been trying to use this new name when we talk about her and pray for her and get in contact with the aunt. Sometimes we'll send a letter. And so we like to use Evelyn's new name. And as we were talking with our boys one evening, our youngest kept trying to get out Evelyn. And he finally said, you know what? I'm just going to call her Valerie. It's a lot easier. And it is. Sometimes new things don't take root as well or as easily as we'd hoped. And it's just easier to fall back to the old. You know, we have talked about in Christ, we're a new creation, but there's still this battle. Some of us still carry around angerness, bitterness, hopelessness, selfishness. And we become an antithesis of the one we proclaim to follow. See, the only thing that really brings worth and eternal significance to my life is the love and grace that God has shown me through Jesus Christ. We're told the one that leaves the 99 for the one, the prodigal or the father who welcomes the prodigal son, this radical sacrificial love that God has for us. Paul says we're also called into that, right? That's the good news of the gospel. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But now we're part of the ministry of reconciliation, reconciled through Christ, and now we're part of it. And so we should be reflections of Christ. And I have this feeling that more often than not, when things get hard, when we just hear the anger or the confusion, our first reaction is self-preservation. Our first reaction is self-preservation. Some of us more than others, but if we're going to be honest with ourselves, there are moments in our lives where it's easier to get angry than to take a deep look at ourselves and think, how have I distorted the gospel? How have I given people a different view? Here in Galatians, what had happened was Paul had preached the good news of the gospel, and then he left. And people came in, and they tried to combine the law of Moses back into the gospel of Jesus, kind of the best of both worlds to control it. They said, yeah, Jesus is right, but first you have to be circumcised. Right? First you have to follow these rules. In other words, you need to still look like us, act like us, talk like us, live like us to be part of this gospel movement. When we take inventory of our own lives, we need to ask the question, what about my life stands in the way from other people hearing the good news of Jesus, from experiencing the grace of Jesus? What are the things in my life that I put up as roadblocks? And one of the ways that we find that out isn't to sit in a room full of people who look like us, talk like us, and act like us and think, well, what do we need to do differently? But to go to people who don't necessarily feel comfortable in our churches or our denominations and say, how can I be a better listener? How can I help empower and equip you? How can I be a better friend in Jesus to you? And listen to the responses. I've been on too many videos. So I'm here at Jerome, Idaho, Dairy Queen, hanging out with my friend Harriman. And I met you about 2 years ago, but have just gotten to know you a little bit better. And so we're going to ask him a couple questions and get his perspective on some of the things we've been talking about. So I'm just going to ask for you to introduce yourself and what you do here in Jerome, what your life looks like.
Amen. My name is Harriman Randall, originally from Seattle. Been in Jerome, Idaho for 14 years, and I've been a pastor at the Overcomers Church for the last 6 years, and was a youth pastor at the First Presbyterian Church of Jerome.
Okay, which is where I'm currently at now. So I heard this guy's name before I actually met him.
Yeah.
He's got a heart for this community. I want to talk a little bit about your call experience and what it was like for you, how the church equipped you and called you into ministry, and what they did to really set you up for success.
Well, one day in church, the pastor at the time, he asked us, if you can look back on your life at this time, what would you say? And I happen to say, I used to be a no-good loser, but now I'm a certified overcomer. And later on that day, a lady in the church, she came up to me and said, whatever you set your mind to in ministry, keep your faith in God and you can accomplish your goals.
Yeah. So we've talked about, I mean, we live in a crazy world right now, right? There's,
Yes.
at least in my 40 years, I've never felt so much divisiveness. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. You've talked about your experiences here a little bit. For those of you who don't know, in southern Idaho, there are not a lot of people who aren't white, right, walking around. So you might be one of the few, if only, African-American pastors in Jerome, right? But during your call, how have you felt, have there been ways that you felt that you were put at a disadvantage, not being a middle-class white man?
It took a while for me to see that disadvantage, because the one thing the church taught me was to love my brothers and sisters in Christ. And as time went on, I started to hear complaints. He preached too loud. Or, oh, that's the black pastor. Instead of me just being a pastor. So I was discouraged for a while, but I knew I had this calling in my life, so I just continued to go forward.
So I want to ask a question. You said, particularly the speaking to has a lot on delivery. Would it be fair to say that people critiqued your culture or your delivery more than they were looking at your content, what you're actually speaking?
Yes. I do recognize that I do talk with a lisp, but every once in a while, my wording, it comes out how I grew up in my environment instead of my educational speaking ways. So, yeah, I have to go through that sometimes.
Okay. Well, I always think this is interesting because, you know, I'm a country boy who's preaching in a country church, and people are like, oh, you articulate so well. And I'm like, you apparently haven't talked to my seminary professors, because they would disagree with you. But a lot of that, would it be fair to say that, I'm not even going to ask the question that way. We're going to edit that out. Would it be fair, how do I want to ask this question? I had it in my mind. I'm supposed to be the one prepared. And when you were doing that, and you made a comment, we were talking earlier, you said something along the lines like, it took me a while to feel comfortable, like I had to be me in a pulpit. I think those are the words you used.
Yes.
How did you come to that? How did you come to that point in your life?
I got to the point where I was trying to please everyone, and I wasn't feeling comfortable within myself. And one day I just got on my knees and I just prayed to God. I was like, God, this is who I am. I always was to the point where I'm like, I'm just waiting on God, I'm waiting on God. And then one day it hit me like, maybe God's waiting on you. And that took me to a place where, oh, I have to be myself. Instead of trying to please everyone, I have to be myself. And if I'm myself, then I can walk truly in the calling that God has called me to do.
Did you have any support from the church in that, or is that something you kind of felt was just between you and God and He brought you there?
Honestly, the oldest lady in my church and the oldest man in my church, I don't know how they knew, but when they got me alone, they pointed out, you gotta be you. Both the lady and the man, both of them said, you have to be you.
Yeah.
I don't know how they knew, but the way they looked at me, they knew.
They knew. Well, so here's the $1 million question, for lack of a better term. If you had a chance to be CEO of the white churches across America, and I know that's a broad spectrum with everything that we have, what are ways or some changes that you would want to make that allow us to be better at making room for voices to be heard that aren't just middle-class white males or middle-aged white males?
I would definitely have a guest speaker at least once a year from a different nationality come in and preach. But also, I would try to reach out to the community to bring different nationalities into the ministry, honestly, because I feel like when people have the experience to deal with someone of a different race, they can get to know them better instead of just on the outside looking in, whatnot. So what I would change would be definitely trying to place someone of a different nationality into ministry.
So not just enough to say, anybody can preach, but to actually invite that into your church and make intentional efforts.
Yeah, because sometimes we just got to come out of our comfort zone, and we have to take actions, and sometimes you have to shock the congregation.
Yeah. So Harriman is, again, I'm going to say Harriman is a pastor at Overcomers Church here in Jerome, and so as we take time to pray over the weekend and stuff, I'm going to encourage you to pray for him and to pray for his church, Overcomers Church, right down the road. I do want to ask you to tell one last story, if that's okay, before we go, or to give your insight. We talked a lot about your experience here in the context of Black Lives Matters and the movement, and some of your friends in Seattle and how that differs. Can you just give us your insight on that a little bit?
Honestly, the police have treated me very well up here in Jerome, to be honest with you. I don't see the aggression in the small town as I do in the big city. Not saying that it's not here, but me personally, I have not seen it. So what I want actually white Americans to understand is that even though you live in a small town, the one thing I'm noticing now is the young people, they can get on social media and they can be exposed to the big city. So we're gonna have to come to a grip about what's going on, because our kids, they're looking toward us for answers. They're looking to see if we're real or are we just talking to them.
I think that's something I don't think about often, but I guess I got 2 little ones at home, but that's going to be more real. Like you can't isolate from this anymore with social media. It's going to be a reality that everyone needs to confront and deal with. So
Yeah.
probably a good thing, you say?
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to changes.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to working with you. Reverend Mike is a great guy. He doesn't shy away from tough subjects, and that's what I love about him.
I didn't pay him to say that
No,
either,
he
right?
did not.
Well, Herman, thanks for your time. And we're going to take a break here and come up with some wrap up here in just a moment. But again, thank you for your time, man.
Appreciate you very much.